Imagine waking up one morning and the credit cards don't work. The car is gone from the driveway. The staff has quietly disappeared overnight. And the only person in the world who could have arranged all of this is sleeping peacefully in the next room. The one person you trusted completely. The one person you would have given your life for. Your own sister, two sisters, same blood, same upbringing. Same father, one of the wealthiest men who has ever walked this earth. And $50 between them. What happened next will make you question everything you think you know about family, about loyalty, and about what money truly does to people when the pressure gets high enough. Stay with me, because the betrayal in this story, you will not see it coming, not even close. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And please don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists inside a very wealthy home. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of everything being exactly precisely controlled. The temperature, the lighting, the sound of footsteps on marble, the way voices are kept low even when there is no reason to whisper. It is the silence of power. And it was in exactly this kind of silence that two young girls grew up, in a home so large that you could spend an entire afternoon walking its hallways and still not see every room. Their father, Richard Caldwell, was not the kind of man who appeared on magazine covers. He was not the kind of man who gave interviews or attended galas or posted photographs of his life on the internet. Richard Caldwell was the kind of man who preferred that very few people knew exactly how much he was worth. And the reason for that preference was simple. He had spent a lifetime watching what happened to people the moment they found out you had money. He had watched friendships curdle. He had watched family members transform overnight into strangers wearing the masks of people he used to love. And he had made a decision very early in his life that he would keep the full scale of his wealth as quiet as he possibly could. But the truth has a way of leaking out, especially when the truth is as enormous as Richard Caldwell's truth. By the time his two daughters were teenagers, the word that people used, carefully in hushed tones, was not billionaire. The word was something larger. Something that most people cannot even hold in their minds long enough to make it feel real. The word was trillionaire, or close enough to it that the distinction felt academic. Richard had built his fortune the way a cathedral is built, slowly, with extraordinary patience, one stone at a time. He had started with a single import business in his mid-20s, working out of a small office in a city that had not yet decided to be great. He worked hours that most people would not believe if you told them. He slept 4, sometimes 5 hours a night. He read every contract himself. He knew every number. He trusted very few people and verified everything. And by the time he was 40, the business had grown into a portfolio: real estate, technology infrastructure, agricultural holdings across 3 continents, energy, manufacturing. And then quietly, financial instruments so complex that only a handful of people in the world fully understood what they were. Richard Caldwell did not become wealthy because he was lucky. He became wealthy because he was relentless. And because he understood something about money that most people never learn. He used to say it at Sunday dinners, every single Sunday without fail, while his 2 daughters sat on either side of him at a table long enough to seat 20. He would look at both of them and say it slowly, the way a person says something they want to stay with you forever. Money does not reveal who you are, he would say. Money reveals who you were always going to be. His older daughter, we will call her Elena, used to write it down in a small leather notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. His younger daughter, we will call her Mara, used to look out the window when he said it. The way someone looks out a window when they have heard something so many times that they have stopped hearing it. Neither of them knew back then how much that sentence would cost them. Elena Caldwell was born first, and from the very beginning, she moved through the world like someone who had already decided exactly where she was going. She had her father's eyes, that particular shade of gray that looks almost silver in certain light. She had his posture, straight, deliberate, the kind of posture that makes people in a room unconsciously straighten their own backs. She was sharp in the way that cuts clean, without drama, almost politely. At 14 years old, she was reading financial reports for pleasure. Not because anyone asked her to, not because anyone assigned them to her, because she found them genuinely interesting in the way that other girls her age found novels interesting. She understood leverage before she understood algebra. She understood return on investment before she understood her own heart. By the time Elena was 16, her father had started bringing her to board meetings. Not as a showpiece, not to sit quietly in the corner and observe. He brought her because she was useful, because when she had something to say, it was worth hearing. She would sit at those enormous conference tables, the youngest person in the room by 30 years, and she would ask questions that made men in expensive suits shift uncomfortably in their chairs. The people who worked for Richard Caldwell respected Elena, or they feared her. The line between those two things, in a room that powerful, is thinner than most people realize. Elena knew what she was being built for. She knew it the way you know the shape of a house you have grown up inside. She had never questioned whether she wanted it. Wanting it was simply who she was. Mara Caldwell was born 3 years after her sister, and she entered the world the way a person enters a room that has been waiting for them. Not loudly, but in a way that changed the feeling of the air. Where Elena had their father's eyes, Mara had their mother's, a warm, deep brown. The kind of eyes that made strangers feel immediately and inexplicably comfortable. And Nara was in almost every possible way the opposite of her sister. Mara did not read financial reports. Mara read everything else: history, poetry, memoirs of people who had started with nothing. She had a particular obsession with the stories of people who had rebuilt their lives after losing everything: bankruptcies, disasters, illnesses, and she could quote from those memoirs the way some people quote scripture. As a teenager, Mara had paint on her fingers more often than not. She played the piano badly and with great joy. She had a laugh that her father once described, in one of his rare unguarded moments, as the best sound in the house. But the thing that most defined Mara Caldwell, the thing that set her apart in a family built on accumulation, was that she gave things away. Constantly, reflexively, the way other people breathe. She would spend her entire monthly allowance, and these were allowances that most adults would have considered a respectable salary, on people she barely knew. She snuck out on Saturday mornings before the rest of the house was awake to volunteer at a food pantry in a neighborhood nowhere near the one she lived in. She befriended the household staff in a way that made her father uncomfortable, not because he was unkind to them, but because Mara treated them the way she treated everyone, like they were the most interesting person in the room. Richard Caldwell loved both of his daughters without reservation. This is important. This is the part of the story that is easiest to misread, and the part that matters most. He loved Elena's precision. He loved Mara's warmth, but he worried. He had spent a lifetime watching what the absence of struggle did to wealthy children, and he worried constantly that he had somehow failed to prepare his daughters for the real shape of the world. He worried that Elena was becoming too hard, that the edge she was sharpening would eventually cut the people closest to her. He worried that Mara was becoming too open, that a world full of people willing to take advantage of genuine kindness would eventually break her in ways she would not recover from. And so for years, Richard Caldwell sat with a plan forming quietly in the back of his mind, a test. Not a business exercise, not a classroom assignment, a real test with real stakes and real consequences. The kind of test that could not be faked or coached or prepared for. He waited until Elena was 30 years old. He later said the age was arbitrary. Nobody who knew him believed that for a single second. It was a Tuesday morning in October when Richard Caldwell called both daughters to his study. The study was on the second floor of the main house, at the end of a long corridor lined with photographs that told the story of a family moving through decades. The room itself was exactly what you would expect from a man like Richard: dark wood, tall bookshelves, a desk that had been in the family for 3 generations. One painting on the wall, a landscape, nothing famous, something he had bought from a struggling artist at a street market 30 years ago because he liked the honesty of it. 2 chairs facing the desk. Elena arrived first. She was wearing what she always wore to anything involving her father: a structured blazer, dark trousers, her dark hair pulled back. She sat in the left chair with her hands folded and her face arranged into an expression of calm attention. Mara arrived 4 minutes later, slightly breathless, her coat not quite buttoned. She sat in the right chair and immediately reached over and squeezed Elena's hand once, the way sisters do. Elena squeezed back. Richard Caldwell sat behind his desk for a long moment without speaking. This was not unusual for him. He had spent a lifetime understanding that silence was a form of authority, that the person who could sit comfortably without filling a room with noise was always the most powerful person in it. Both daughters waited, and then he slid a single white envelope across the desk, then another, one in front of each daughter. "Open them," he said. Inside each envelope was a single $50 bill. The rules, as Richard Caldwell laid them out, were 5 in number. He read them from a single sheet of paper in a voice that was completely, deliberately calm, the way a judge reads a sentence. Each daughter would receive $50, cash, nothing else. There would be no access to family accounts, no access to any of the family's properties, no use of family connections, or the family name in any professional capacity. The period of the test would be 90 days, exactly 90 days. Richard Caldwell would be observing throughout the entire period. The nature and extent of his observation would not be disclosed. At the end of 90 days, the outcome of the test would determine the distribution of his estate, his businesses, his holdings, his legacy in its entirety. He set the paper down. He looked at both daughters. He said, "Do you have any questions?" Elena did not move. Her face had not changed. But her eyes, those gray eyes, had gone very still, the way water goes still just before it freezes. She was already thinking. You could almost see it happening. Already building something in her mind. Already identifying the variables. Already planning. Mara had tears in her eyes, not from fear, not from grief. Later, she would struggle to explain exactly what those tears were about. The closest she could get was this: "I cried because I understood, suddenly, that my father had been worried about us for a very long time. And there is something heartbreaking about understanding, all at once, the shape of someone else's fear for you." Richard Caldwell looked at his younger daughter's tears and said nothing. But the people who knew him best said that something moved across his face in that moment. Something that was not quite guilt, but was in the same neighborhood. He had one more thing to tell them. One thing he had not put on the sheet of paper. One thing, he said quietly, almost as an afterthought, but which was in fact the most important thing in the entire room. "You are not being tested individually," he said. "You are being tested against each other." And then he nodded, once to indicate the meeting was over. Elena left the estate at 6 o'clock the following morning. She had spent the previous evening alone in her room, no phone calls, no internet, just a legal pad and a pen, building a plan. By the time she walked out the front door with a single small bag over her shoulder, she had already identified 3 former professional contacts from her own network. People she had cultivated entirely independently of her father's name, who might be willing to offer early support. She had also identified 5 skills she could monetize immediately. She had mapped a 30-day financial runway. She had calculated minimum viable expenses. She had, in essence, treated the $50 the way a field general treats the last battalion, not as a limitation, but as a starting point. Elena Caldwell was afraid, make no mistake about that. But her fear expressed itself as strategy. It always had. Mara left the estate at 9 o'clock in the morning with a small bag, $50, and no plan at all. This is not because she was careless. This is because Mara had spent her whole life operating on instinct and trust rather than strategy and control, and she had learned, or believed she had learned, that this approach generally brought her to exactly the right place at exactly the right time. She rode a bus across the city, not to a professional contact, not to a networking opportunity. She rode the bus to the neighborhood where she had spent Saturday mornings for the past 4 years, volunteering at a food pantry called Grace Table. She went there because it was the only place in the city where she had ever felt fully and completely like herself. Not Richard Caldwell's younger daughter, not the softer, less business-minded sibling, just Mara, a person who showed up and worked and cared and was known for that. The woman who ran Grace Table was named Greta Holloway. She was 63 years old, with the kind of face that belonged to someone who had spent decades absorbing other people's troubles without letting them accumulate into bitterness. Greta had known Mara for 4 years. She did not know who Mara's father was. She had never asked. She knew only that Mara showed up every Saturday, worked harder than anyone else, and left without wanting credit for any of it. When Mara knocked on the back door of Grace Table that October morning and asked if there was a cot somewhere she could sleep and work she could do, Greta Holloway looked at her for a long moment and then said, "The supply room in the back has a folding cot. The coffee is already on. No questions, no conditions, just the door opening." 2 women. Same $50. 2 entirely different instincts about what survival meant. And the story was only just beginning. The first week was, for both sisters, a kind of controlled emergency. Elena's 3 professional contacts came through with exactly the kind of guarded, provisional support you would expect from people who respected her ability but were uncertain about her circumstances. One offered a short-term consulting arrangement reviewing operational documents for a mid-sized logistics firm. The terms were modest. The work was beneath her actual capability. She took it without hesitation and performed it with more precision than the client had any right to expect for that fee. On day 3, the client quietly doubled her rate. Elena noted this in her legal pad and continued working. She was sleeping on a couch in the apartment of a former colleague, a woman named Patricia, an accountant who had once worked tangentially with Elena on a project several years earlier. and who had agreed, somewhat cautiously, to let Elena stay for 2 weeks. The apartment was small and the walls were thin, and Patricia played true crime podcasts at 10 o'clock every night at a volume that kept Elena awake. Elena did not complain. She lay on the couch in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and she used the sleepless hours to keep planning. Mara's first week was quieter and, in its own way, more disorienting. She had spent her adult life moving through spaces that accommodated her, not because she demanded it, simply because the scale of her family's wealth meant that her environment bent around her without her ever having to ask. Now she was sleeping on a folding cot in a supply room that smelled of cleaning products and cardboard. She was waking at 5:30 in the morning to help Greta unload the morning food delivery. She was lifting boxes that were heavier than anything she had lifted in years. She was learning on her feet the precise logistics of feeding 240 families a week on a budget that left no room for error. And she found, to her own considerable surprise, that she was good at it. Not in the spreadsheet way that Elena would have been good at it. In the human way. She remembered names instantly. She noticed when a regular family did not come in, and she followed up. She could tell within 30 seconds of a conversation what someone actually needed versus what they were asking for. Greta watched her for 3 days and then told her, bluntly, that she was the most naturally skilled community worker Greta had encountered in 40 years. Mara laughed and said she thought Greta was being kind. Greta said, "Never kind when I could be accurate." On day 9, Elena's consulting arrangement collapsed. The client, a man named Douglas Whitmore, the operations director of the logistics firm, pulled the contract. He had, in the days since hiring her, done a small amount of research. He had found enough to understand, roughly, who her father was. And Douglas Whitmore had, for years, nursed a particular resentment toward men like Richard Caldwell, the kind of resentment that attaches itself to the nearest available target. He called Elena at 7:30 in the morning and told her the project was being deprioritized. He did not apologize. He did not offer an explanation. He simply ended the contract the way someone hangs up a phone, clean, final, without ceremony. Elena sat with this for exactly 11 minutes. She timed it later without quite knowing why. Then she got up, put on her jacket, and walked to a restaurant 3 blocks away that had a help wanted sign in the window. She asked for the manager. She said she had no restaurant experience, but was willing to work any shift and would not need training on anything involving numbers, organization, or managing a room full of competing priorities. The manager, a woman named Sandra, looked her over and said, "Sunday brunch is a war zone." "Can you handle a war zone?" Elena said. "I prefer it." She was on the floor the following Sunday. The decision to waitress was not desperation. This is the part that people who knew Elena Caldwell found hardest to understand when they heard the story later. Elena had other options. She was already generating small amounts of income through 2 other consultancies. She took the waitressing job because she had realized, lying awake on Patricia's couch, that she had spent her entire adult life understanding systems from above, from the elevated position of someone who built them, or analyzed them, or optimized them. She had never understood a system from inside it, from the floor of it. She wanted to understand what it felt like to trade your physical time and your physical body for money, to understand what it cost, to understand, as she later said, what her father's empire was actually built on top of. What she found surprised her, not the difficulty. She had expected that. What surprised her was the intimacy of it, the way strangers told you things, the way a simple act of genuine attention, remembering someone's name, noticing what they actually needed, changed the entire transaction from a service exchange into something closer to a human connection. She watched this happen, over and over, table after table. And she filed it away with the focused attention of someone who understands, even in unexpected classrooms, when they are being taught something important. By the end of week 3, both sisters had found a kind of fragile footing. Elena was generating enough income to cover basic expenses, with a small surplus accumulating. Mara had become effectively Greta Holloway's right hand at Grace's table. She had reorganized the intake process. She had brought in 3 new volunteer coordinators through her own relationships. She had, working from her phone and with absolutely no budget, connected Grace's table to a regional food bank network that increased their weekly supply by 30%. Greta told her, without drama, that Mara had done more for the organization in 3 weeks than any paid staff member had done in 2 years. Mara did not tell Greta anything about the test. She did not tell Greta about her father. She had decided on day 1 that Grace's table was a place where Mara Caldwell existed as a person rather than as a consequence of her family. She was going to keep it that way. And then on day 22, her phone buzzed. It was Elena. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. Mara sat on the back steps of Grace's table in the cold October air and listened to her sister's voice with the particular quality of attention that she reserved for things that mattered. Elena was not calling to apologize for anything. Elena was calling with a proposal. Clean, precise, already built. Like everything Elena did, the proposal was this. Elena had spent 3 weeks watching the consulting world from a distance and the service world from the inside, and she had identified a gap. Nonprofit organizations, community organizations, food banks, social service providers were often run by extraordinary, passionate people who had almost no business infrastructure. They were burning out. They were losing funding because they did not know how to present their impact data compellingly. They were missing partnerships because they did not know how to identify potential corporate donors who would actually benefit from the association. Elena could fix all of that. She could build operational frameworks, write grant proposals, develop impact reports, create partnership decks. She could do it faster and better than anyone these organizations could normally afford. But she needed an introduction to get in the door. The world she was describing was Mara's world. Every single organization Elena had in mind was one that Mara either knew directly or could reach within one conversation. "I need your community," Elena said. "You need my structure," she said. "The pantry saves on operational costs. Our combined income covers our expenses. We both make it through 90 days. Mara was quiet for a long time. She was looking at the wall of the building beside the back steps. Someone had painted a mural there years ago, a table covered with food, surrounded by people with their hands extended toward each other. "One condition," Mara said finally. "The pantry comes first, always." "Of course," said Elena. Not after a pause, not with reluctance. Immediately, as though this was simply the correct answer to a simple question. Mara said yes. The following 3 weeks were the happiest either sister had been in years. Not because everything was easy. It was not easy. They were working 16-hour days on zero budget in borrowed spaces on borrowed time. Elena had moved out of Patricia's apartment and into a room at a women's residential hotel. $22 a night, shared bathroom, a window that faced a parking structure. Mara was still on the cot in the supply room. They were meeting every morning at 6:30 at a coffee shop midway between their two locations, working for 2 hours before the day officially started, then separating and working through until late evening. But there was something between them during those weeks that was different from anything they had experienced since childhood. A genuine collaboration, not the polite coexistence of two adults who shared a family. A real working partnership where each of them was contributing something the other could not, where the whole they were building was genuinely larger than the sum of its parts. Mara introduced Elena to 7 organizations in the first week. Elena signed 2 consulting contracts before the week was out. By the end of week 4 together, they had 3 active clients, a small but growing reputation in the nonprofit sector, and enough income that both sisters had moved beyond bare survival into something that actually felt sustainable. Greta Holloway watched the 2 of them working side by side at the long table in Grace Table's back room one evening and said quietly to no one in particular, "That is what sisters are supposed to look like." Neither of them heard her. They were too busy working now. Before we go any further into this story, I need you to understand something. Because what comes next is the part of this story that is hardest to hold. Not because it is complicated, but because it is so recognizable. The thing that happened was not the act of a cartoon villain. It was not a scheme hatched in the dark. It was the kind of thing that happens inside the mind of a person who is afraid, genuinely, deeply afraid, and who makes a decision about that fear in a moment of very quiet, very private weakness. It was the kind of thing that nearly everyone, if they are honest, has felt the pull of at least once in their life. And it is the kind of thing that once done cannot be undone, only survived. Only eventually forgiven. Remember that. Hold on to it. Because the rest of this story depends on you holding on to it. On day 47, Elena was alone in the small office space they had rented. A 12 by 14 room above a dry cleaner that cost $400 a month, split between them, doing routine administrative work. She was reviewing incorporation paperwork for Grace Table as part of a broader operational audit she had been conducting for Greta. It was the kind of work Elena could do in her sleep. She moved through the documents quickly, noting issues, flagging questions, building a list of items to address. And then she found something. It was buried in the corporate registry documents, 3 layers deep. Grace Table was registered under a parent nonprofit organization. The parent organization was registered under a separate holding entity. And the holding entity, after another layer of shell structure, traced back to a subsidiary of one of Richard Caldwell's companies. Elena read the chain of ownership again, slowly, then a third time. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the wall in front of her for a very long time. The funding crisis that had brought Mara to Grace Table, the building lease that was about to expire, the operational shortfall that had made Mara's presence feel essential. None of it had to be happening. The parent entity could have resolved it with a single internal transfer. The lease could have been renewed without drama. The entire crisis was, at minimum, something that Richard Caldwell had the power to prevent. And he had chosen not to prevent it. He had, it appeared, arranged for it to exist. Elena thought about this for a very long time. She thought about what it meant. She thought about what she could do with it. And here is where the story turns. Not because Elena Caldwell made a monstrous choice, but because she made a human one. The worst kind of human one. The kind that lives in the gap between what you know is right and what fear tells you you need to do. She had two choices. She could tell Mara immediately. She could show her sister the documentation, explain what it meant. Let Mara decide what to do with the knowledge that the crisis she had spent 47 days pouring herself into had been engineered. This was the obvious choice, the clean choice, the choice Elena knew was right. Or she could keep it to herself, hold the information. Use it, not by disclosing it to Arthur, not by weaponizing it, but simply by being the only one who knew it. The one who saw clearly when Mara could not. The one who understood the full picture when Mara was working from an incomplete one. In the contest their father had constructed, clarity was currency. Elena had just found a vault that Mara did not know existed. She sat with this decision for 4 days. 4 days of working beside her sister. 4 days of their morning coffee meetings and their 16-hour days, and their shared exhaustion, and their very real growing warmth for each other. 4 days of knowing something she had not told. 4 days is not a long time. 4 days is long enough for a silence to become a choice, and a choice to become a betrayal. On day 48, Mara got a call from a man named Robert Park. Robert Park was the owner of a successful regional hardware chain who had grown up in the same neighborhood where Grace Table operated. He had driven past the pantry every week of his adult life. He had thought about doing something for years. He had researched Grace Table independently, found Mara's name on a recent partnership document, and tracked down her number through the nonprofit network. He wanted to fund the pantry, fully. Operational costs covered for 2 years, with a potential renewal. No strings, no naming rights, no board seat. Just money because the work was right and the community deserved it. Mara sat down in the middle of Grace Table's main room, surrounded by folding tables and donated food, and cried. Not quietly. The kind of crying that your body does when it has been holding something very tight for a long time, and suddenly the grip releases. She had spent 48 days working towards something that she had not even dared to name as a goal. And it had arrived not because of her father's money or her family's connections. It had arrived because she had shown up again and again, until the work itself spoke loudly enough for someone to hear. She called Elena first. Elena answered on the second ring. Mara told her everything, her voice still unsteady. She told her about Robert Park, about the 2-year commitment, about the fact that it was real and unconditional and earned. I did it, Mara said. Elena, I actually did it. Elena was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then she said, That's wonderful, Mara, that's really wonderful. Her voice was warm. Her voice was the voice of a sister who was genuinely happy, and she was. That is the part of this that keeps you awake at night. Elena was genuinely happy for Mara in that moment. Both things were true simultaneously. The love was real, and so was the fear. The fear said Robert Park knew the family name. It said verify this before you celebrate. It said Mara has not won this cleanly, not completely. And if she has not won it cleanly, then what you are sitting on, the documentation, the knowledge, the 4-day silence, is not a betrayal. It is strategy. It is exactly what your father raised you to practice. Elena made 2 phone calls that afternoon. Neither of them was to Mara. The first was to a researcher she had worked with years before, asking for a discreet background check on Robert Park and his history with the Caldwell family name. The second call came back within 24 hours. Robert Park had, in the course of his research, come across Mara's last name. He had known what it meant. He had made the donation anyway, because of the work he had witnessed, but the recognition had been there. Elena read this report and felt, she later said, a sensation like the ground settling, like something clicking into place. She did not examine this sensation carefully. She did not ask herself whether it was relief or justification. She simply moved forward. On day 51, Elena contacted her father, not by phone, in person, at a hotel lobby 12 blocks from the estate, a meeting she did not tell Mara about. What happened in that meeting is something we know only in fragments. We know what Elena brought. We know what she said. And we know what she did not say, what she chose to leave out. Because in the end, that is where the real story lives, not in the lie, in the omission, in the carefully curated version of the truth. She brought financial documentation for a for-profit consulting model built on the nonprofit sector work she and Mara had developed together. She brought the ownership chain she had discovered, the connection between Grace Table and their father's holdings, framed not as evidence of his engineering, but as evidence of her own perceptiveness. "Look what I found," she was saying. "Look how clearly I see." And she brought something else. A version of Mara's story that was technically accurate in every individual fact and deeply structurally dishonest in its architecture. She told Richard Caldwell that Robert Park had given to Grace Table, at least in part, because he recognized the Caldwell name. This was true. She did not tell him that Park had researched the organization independently for months before making contact. She did not tell him that Greta Holloway had confirmed, privately, that Mara had never once used her family name during her entire time at Grace Table. She did not tell him that the operational improvements Mara had made to the organization were documented in a 3-week audit that Elena herself had conducted, and that showed, unambiguously, that Mara's contributions had been genuine and profound. She gave her father a partial picture and let him draw the conclusion the partial picture suggested. Mara, she implied, had benefited from the family name without knowing it, which meant that Mara's success was not fully Mara's, which meant that the test results were not as clean as they appeared, which meant that Elena, who had navigated 90 days on the basis of documented, verifiable, independent work, was the one who had truly passed. Richard Caldwell listened to all of this without interrupting. His face gave nothing away. His face never gave anything away. He thanked Elena for coming. He stood up. He walked her to the door, and he said, "I'll be in touch." 2 weeks later, both daughters were called back to the estate. Not to the study, to the garden. The walled garden on the east side of the property where both girls had played as children, where the apricot tree their mother had planted still bore fruit every September, where the oldest bench in the property sat under an oak tree that had been there longer than the house. Richard Caldwell stood when they arrived. Both daughters noticed this. He almost never stood. He spoke for 11 minutes. Mara timed it without meaning to. She counted later, trying to understand the exact shape of what had just happened to her. 11 minutes for a verdict 30 years in the making. He praised Elena's strategic clarity. He acknowledged Mara's extraordinary human capacity. He said that the test had been revealing in ways he had not fully anticipated. And then he told them what he had decided. Elena would take primary control of the business portfolio, the companies, the investments, the international holdings, the empire. Mara would receive the philanthropic foundation, already established, already funded, an endowment sufficient to operate for decades, designed to do exactly the work Mara cared about, at scale, with real resources behind it. He presented this as equity, as the matching of each daughter to the domain she was best suited for. He was measured, he was fair. He was the most dangerous thing a person in power can be in the moment of rendering a verdict. He was reasonable. Elena kept her face still. Her hands were folded in her lap. There was something in her eyes, something Mara caught, just for a second, and could not quite name. Not triumph, not guilt, something more complicated than either of those. The expression of a person who has gotten what they were after and found upon arrival that it does not feel the way they expected. Mara said nothing for a long time. She was looking at the apricot tree, at the bark of it, at the way the afternoon light moved through its bare October branches. She had grown up next to that tree. She had eaten from it. She had climbed it badly and fallen out of it once, at age 8, and Elena had been the one to help her up. She looked at her father. She said, "Thank you." She said she needed some time, and she left. She did not look at Elena when she left. Mara went back to Grace Table. She walked the whole way. It took 40 minutes. She did not call anyone. She did not put in her earbuds. She just walked through the city in the October cold, watching the faces of the people she passed, feeling the particular weight of understanding something you cannot unfeel once you have felt it. She knew what had happened. She did not have documentation yet. She did not have specifics. But she had spent 30 years watching Elena work, and she understood, in the same bone-deep way you understand when you have been lied to by someone who loves you, that something in what had just unfolded was shaped by her sister's hand. She pushed open the back door of Grace Table and found Greta at the long sorting table, going through canned goods with the focused, peaceful attention Greta brought to every task. Greta looked up. She looked at Mara's face. She set down the can of beans she was holding. She pulled out a chair at the table and sat down and said, "Okay, tell me," and Mara did. She told Greta everything: the test, the $50, the 90 days, the partnership with Elena, the phone call from Robert Park, the verdict, the estate, the foundation, all of it. Greta listened without moving. When Mara had finished, Greta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" Mara said yes. Greta said, "The building we're sitting in. Did you ever check who owns it?" Mara spent the next 2 hours at the table in Greta's back office, going through documents. When she was finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then slowly she began to laugh, not bitterly, not with grief or anger or the sharp edge of betrayal. She laughed the way a person laughs when they have been so completely and elaborately outmaneuvered by someone who loves them that the only possible response is a kind of stunned, reluctant awe. The building had been donated to Grace Table 6 months before the test began, anonymously, through a foundation registered under a name that meant nothing on its surface. The parent entity of Grace Table's parent organization, the funding crisis, the lease emergency that had brought Mara to Grace Table in the first place, the specific orchestrated circumstances that had put Mara in exactly this neighborhood, at exactly this table, on exactly day 1 of 90. Richard Caldwell had not been watching the test. Richard Caldwell had built the test, from the ground up, from the outside in, every piece of it, including the crisis that had led Mara to where she needed to go, including the breadcrumb in the corporate documents that Elena was perfectly positioned to find, including, almost certainly, the precise question of what each daughter would do with what they discovered. He had watched Elena find the ownership chain. He had watched her sit on it for 4 days. He had watched her walk into that hotel lobby with a partial picture and present it as a complete one. He had already known the truth about Robert Park, had verified it independently before Elena ever sat down across from him. He had let Elena speak. He had let her build her case. And he had listened with the full understanding of a man who knew every fact she was choosing to present and every fact she was choosing to omit. The test had never been about the $50. The test had never been about survival. The test had been about a single question, the oldest question, the only question that matters when the stakes are high enough and no one appears to be watching. Who do you become? 2 weeks after the day in the garden, Richard Caldwell called both daughters back to the estate, not to the study, not to the garden, to a small sitting room on the ground floor that they had always as children, called the Yellow Room because of the pale yellow walls. It was the room where their mother used to read, the room where they had opened Christmas presents, the room that meant family in the original, uncomplicated sense of that word. Richard Caldwell was sitting in one of the armchairs when they arrived. He looked older than he had 2 weeks before, not tired, just older. The way people look when they have spent time with something heavy. He told them he had been thinking. He told them the original verdict stood in its basic structure. Elena would lead the business holdings. Mara would run the foundation. But then he said that he had made 2 revisions. The first revision was a governance structure. The business portfolio would be overseen by a board. The board would include, in addition to financial and legal advisors, a permanent community council, representatives from the kinds of communities where Richard's businesses operated. Mara-style voices, he called them, and for the first time in the conversation, Elena looked directly at her sister. Mara was looking at the floor. The second revision was Mara's seat, on every major board. Not ceremonial, not advisory, full voting rights. Full veto authority on any decision that could materially harm the communities the businesses operated in. This was not a gift. Richard was clear about that. He said it was a correction. A structural correction for something he should have built into the original design. And then he asked Elena to stay after Mara left. He asked her to sit with him in the Yellow Room for a while longer. And when they were alone in the room where they had opened Christmas presents where her mother had read, Richard Caldwell looked at his eldest daughter and said, very quietly, without anger, without accusation, simply as one clear-eyed person asking another, "Was the win worth the sister?" Elena did not answer that day. She sat in the Yellow Room for a long time after her father left. The light changed in the windows. The afternoon moved into evening. She sat with the question the way you sit with a wound, not touching it yet, just becoming aware of its exact location, understanding the depth of it before you decide what to do. She knew the answer. She had known it before her father asked. She had known it if she was honest with herself, since the moment she had walked into that hotel lobby, since the moment she had made the decision to present a partial picture as a complete one, since the 4-day silence that had been the original sin of everything that followed. No, the win had not been worth the sister. There was no version of the math that made that calculation work. Elena Caldwell was, in almost every domain of her life, exceptional. She was one of those rare people who are genuinely brilliant and who work as hard as someone without the gift. She understood systems, she understood people. She understood money and power and how they moved through the world. She had, by every objective measure, the skills to build something extraordinary with what her father had given her. And she did. That part of the story is real and it matters. But she had also learned in a hotel lobby, in a single conversation, that she was capable of something she had not known was in her. That there was a version of herself, afraid, competitive, hungry, that would shade the truth about her sister's work in order to win. That the thing her father had always worried about, that edge becoming something that cut what she loved, was not a hypothetical. It was a fact. Something she now had to live with, something she had to decide what to do with. For 8 months, Elena and Mara did not speak. 8 months of silence after 30 years of sisterhood. 8 months of the ordinary life of two people continuing to exist in a world where the other person is present but entirely closed off. 8 months of Elena working 16-hour days building something real with the portfolio she had been given, and of Mara growing the foundation into something that reached 3 states by month 6, and of both of them learning, in their separate silences, something essential about who they were when they were not being defined by each other. Elena changed the company's philanthropic strategy in the second year of running the portfolio. Nobody asked her to, nobody suggested it. She did it because she had spent enough time making the numbers work to understand, at a structural level, that sustainable success in the places where her father's businesses operated required genuine investment in those communities. Not charity, investment. Mara-style thinking applied at Elena-style scale. She never used those words. But the people who knew both sisters recognized the architecture immediately. The call came on a Thursday in November, 8 months and 11 days after the day in the garden. Elena called from her office at a time she had not planned and had not scripted. She sat with her phone in her hand for a long time before she dialed. Then she did it before she could stop herself. Mara's phone rang 4 times. Elena counted. Then Mara picked up. Elena said, "I'm sorry. I was scared. I thought winning meant taking everything. I didn't know that included you." Mara was quiet on the other end of the line. Elena could hear the ambient sound of what was probably Grace's table in the background. Voices. The familiar hum of a working space. Then Mara said, "I know. I've known for a while." And then she said, "Come to the pantry on Saturday. We need help with the harvest distribution." "You're good at logistics," Elena said. "Okay." And she went. There is a particular kind of story that our culture loves to tell about wealthy families. It is a story about greed and corruption, about money destroying what should have been preserved, about the inheritance that tears a family apart forever. We consume these stories with the particular hunger of people who want, on some level, to believe that wealth always corrupts, that families built on power always collapse under their own weight, that the ending is always a courtroom or a broken relationship or a betrayal that cannot be undone. This story does not end that way. I want to be honest about why. It does not end that way because of Mara. Not entirely because of Elena's guilt, not entirely because of Richard's engineering, not entirely because good sense prevailed. It ends the way it does because Mara Caldwell is the kind of person who understands, at a level that goes below thought, that holding a grudge against someone who was afraid is a form of self-punishment that has nothing to do with justice. She is the kind of person for whom forgiveness is not a gift she gives because she is noble. It is a practice she maintains because she has seen up close what the alternative does to people. She has watched enough lives at Grace's table to understand that the people who cannot put down the weight of what was done to them are the people who stop being able to build anything new. She forgave Elena, not all at once, not on the phone that November, over time. The way you rebuild something that has been damaged, carefully, deliberately, one act of trust at a time. Richard Caldwell lived to see all of it. He sat in the yellow room in the last years of his life and watched his daughters become something he had worked 40 years to make possible. Not wealthy. They were already wealthy. He watched them become capable. Not of running companies or managing foundations. Capable of knowing themselves. Capable of living in the specific, difficult, irreplaceable richness of a relationship with another person that has been tested down to its foundation and survived. He told his closest friend, in one of the last conversations of his life, that the test had taught him something he had not expected to learn. The friend asked what? Richard Caldwell looked out the window of the yellow room for a moment. Then he said, "I spent my whole life building something to leave behind. And I almost left behind the wrong thing." The friend asked what he meant. Richard said, "I almost left them an inheritance." Instead, I left them each other. The $50 is long gone. The 90 days have been over for years. The estate still stands. The portfolio still grows. The foundation now operates in 4 states, with a waiting list of communities requesting partnership. Grace Table is still in the same building. Greta Holloway still works there, though she jokes about retiring every 6 months and never does. Mara still shows up on Saturday mornings. Old habits. The good ones. Elena sits on Grace Table's board. She reorganized their supply chain in the first year and saved them enough to add a second distribution day. She and Mara have dinner on the first Sunday of every month, at a table that fits exactly 2 people deliberately chosen for its size. They talk for hours. About the work, about the family, about the apricot tree in the yellow room and what it was like to grow up in a house where silence was a form of authority. About what they want to build next. They do not talk about the hotel lobby. They do not need to. It is present in everything else they say, the way the scar of a healed wound is present in the skin above it. A permanent reminder of what happened. A permanent reminder that it did not end them. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with the questions that have been living with me since I first found this story. Not because they have easy answers. Because easy answers would be an insult to the complexity of what you just spent 2 hours with. Was Elena a villain? Or was she a person who was afraid and who made a choice she could not take back and who then spent the rest of her life making a different kind of choice? Where does that line actually live? If you were Mara, could you have made that phone call on a November Thursday? Not perform the forgiveness. Actually made it? And the hardest one. The one I keep returning to. The one I think this whole story was actually about all along. Is there someone in your life right now, someone you love, for whom you are sitting on a 4-day silence? Something you know, something you have chosen not to say, because saying it would cost you something you are afraid to give up. I am not judging, I am asking, because the $50 was never the test, the silence was. It always is. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me, Team Elena or Team Mara, would you have made that phone call? Have you ever been on either side of this story? I read every single comment, everyone. And if this story found something real inside you, if it got underneath your skin the way it got underneath mine, please hit that subscribe button right now, because next story is one I have been sitting on for a long time. It involves a mother, a will, a secret kept for 40 years, and a piece of evidence that came to light 3 weeks after the funeral. And it will make everything you thought you understood about the word family feel brand new. I will see you in my next video.